I remember the exact moment I realized that the person I trusted most in this world had been selling pieces of my soul to the woman who had already torn it apart once. It was a Tuesday evening in October, the kind of crisp autumn night in Boston where the leaves scatter across the sidewalk like whispered secrets, and I was sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of bourbon that had grown warm in my hand because I had not moved for nearly 40 minutes. My phone was on the table in front of me, the screen dark, but I could not stop staring at it because of what I had just seen, what I had just learned, what had just shattered 15 years of brotherhood in the span of a single screenshot. Jordan Calloway was not just my best friend. He was the closest thing I had to a brother. We had met freshman year at Boston University, two kids from working-class families trying to figure out how to navigate a world that felt designed for people with trust funds and connections. His father worked at a shipyard in Baltimore. My mother cleaned houses in Dorchester while raising me and my two younger sisters alone after my father walked out when I was 7. We bonded over that shared understanding that nothing would ever be handed to us, that every inch of progress we made would be clawed and scraped and earned through sheer force of will. For 15 years, Jordan was there. He was the best man at my wedding. He held me together when my marriage fell apart. He loaned me money when I was between jobs and never once asked for it back. He introduced me to clients who helped build my freelance software consulting business. He was the godfather to my niece, my emergency contact on every form, the person I called when I got the news that my mother had cancer and I could not breathe, and I needed someone to remind me how to exist. So when I tell you that discovering his betrayal felt like having my chest cracked open and my heart removed with surgical precision, I need you to understand the depth of what was lost. This was not a casual friendship. This was not someone who drifted in and out of my life. This was the person I would have taken a bullet for without hesitation, the person I believed with absolute certainty would do the same for me. The truth arrived in my inbox, disguised as a message from someone I did not recognize. The email address was a random string of letters and numbers at a generic provider, the kind of anonymous account people create when they want to deliver information without being traced. The subject line simply said, "You deserve to know what your best friend has been doing." I almost deleted it. I almost dismissed it as spam or some kind of scam. But something made me click, some instinct that whispered through the rational part of my brain and told me that this message was different, that this message was going to change everything. Inside were screenshots. Dozens of them, text conversations between Jordan and my ex-wife Vanessa, spanning nearly 8 months. The messages were damning in their casual cruelty, their calculated coordination, their complete and utter violation of everything I had believed about my friendship with Jordan. It started, according to the timestamps, just 3 weeks after my divorce was finalized. Vanessa had reached out to Jordan through Facebook, which I found grimly ironic because she had always claimed to despise social media. The opening message was simple. "We need to talk about Marcus. There are things you should know." What followed was a systematic campaign to destroy me emotionally. Vanessa wanted ammunition. She wanted to know my weaknesses, my fears, my insecurities. She wanted the private thoughts I had shared with Jordan in moments of vulnerability, the confessions I had made when I was broken and desperate and trying to make sense of why my marriage had collapsed, and Jordan gave her everything. He told her about the panic attacks I started having after the divorce, the ones I had only admitted to him because I was ashamed and scared and did not know who else to trust. He told her about my fear that I was fundamentally unlovable, a wound that traced back to my father's abandonment, and that I had spent years in therapy trying to heal. He told her about the woman I had started dating 6 months after the divorce, a kind kindergarten teacher named Rachel who made me laugh for the first time in what felt like years, and Vanessa used that information to send Rachel anonymous messages claiming I was stalking my ex-wife and had been emotionally abusive during our marriage. Rachel stopped returning my calls after that. She blocked me on everything. I spent months wondering what I had done wrong, what invisible flaw in my character had driven her away, never knowing that the sabotage had come from my own best friend's betrayal. But it got worse. So much worse. The screenshots showed Jordan sending Vanessa actual copies of messages I had sent him. Private texts where I poured out my grief and anger and confusion. Messages where I admitted that some nights I drank too much because the silence in my apartment was unbearable. Messages where I confessed that I sometimes wondered if Vanessa had been right about me, if I really was as cold and emotionally unavailable as she had claimed during our final screaming argument, if maybe I deserved to be alone. Vanessa was not just collecting this information out of curiosity, she was using it. She was forwarding these messages to mutual friends, to colleagues we had both known, to anyone who would listen to her narrative that I was unstable, dangerous, a man coming apart at the seams. She was building a case, constructing an image of me as someone to be pitied and feared, someone whose word could not be trusted, and Jordan was her willing supplier. The messages between them showed a relationship that had evolved beyond simple information exchange. There was flirtation. There were inside jokes at my expense. There was a dinner I was never told about, then drinks, then more. The final screenshot in the collection was a selfie Jordan had sent Vanessa, the two of them sitting close together at a restaurant I recognized, his arm around her shoulder, both of them smiling like they had gotten away with something. Maybe they had been sleeping together. The screenshots did not prove it definitively, but the intimacy in their messages suggested something beyond friendship. The worst part was that I almost did not care about that. If Jordan wanted to pursue my ex-wife, that would have been a betrayal on its own, but one I might have eventually understood. Attraction is irrational. Hearts want what they want. I could have processed that, given enough time and distance. But the deliberate campaign to destroy my reputation, my relationships, my sense of self, the calculated exploitation of every vulnerable confession I had ever made, that was something else entirely. That was not a moment of weakness or poor judgment. That was a choice, made repeatedly over months, to weaponize my trust against me. I sat at that kitchen table for hours, reading and rereading the screenshots until every word was seared into my memory. I did not cry. I was too hollowed out for tears. I felt like I had been running a marathon and had finally crossed what I thought was the finish line, only to discover that the race had been a lie all along, that I had been running in circles while everyone watched and laughed. The bourbon eventually ran out. The night eventually ended. And somewhere in those dark hours between midnight and dawn, I made a decision that would shape the next year of my life. I was going to destroy Jordan Calloway. Not physically, not illegally, not in any way that would give him the satisfaction of playing the victim. I was going to dismantle the carefully constructed image he had spent his entire adult life building, the facade of the loyal friend, the devoted husband, the trustworthy businessman. I was going to expose who he really was, and I was going to make sure that exposure cost him everything he valued. But revenge, real revenge, requires patience. It requires planning. It requires the cold, methodical approach of someone who understands that the best punishment is not a single devastating blow, but a slow and systematic unraveling. Jordan had spent months betraying me. I would take as long as I needed to ensure that his reckoning was complete. The first thing I did was nothing. For 2 weeks, I acted completely normal. I answered Jordan's texts with my usual casual responses. I met him for our regular Thursday night drinks at the sports bar we had been going to for years. I listened to his complaints about his job, his jokes about politics, his animated retellings of whatever show he was binging on streaming. I laughed in all the right places. I nodded sympathetically at his frustrations. I was the same Marcus I had always been, reliable and supportive and utterly oblivious to anything being wrong. It was the hardest acting performance of my life. Every time he clapped me on the shoulder, every time he called me brother, every time he asked how I was doing with that tone of concerned friendship he had perfected, I wanted to slam his face into the bar and demand an explanation. I wanted to scream, wanted to confront, wanted to ask how he could sit across from me and pretend that everything was fine when he had been methodically feeding my darkest moments to the woman who had already hurt me more than anyone else in my life. But I controlled myself. I smiled and drank my beer, and reminded myself that impulsive confrontation would only give him the opportunity to spin a story, to play the victim, to somehow turn this around on me. Jordan had always been gifted at manipulation. He had a way of reframing situations that made you doubt your own perception of events. If I came at him without proof, without a plan, without an airtight case that left no room for his usual deflections, he would find a way to make me look like the crazy one. So instead of confronting, I investigated. I needed to understand why. I needed to know what possible motivation Jordan could have had for betraying me so completely. The anonymous email had come from someone who clearly knew things they should not have known. Someone with access to Jordan's private messages, or at least some of them. I spent hours trying to figure out who might have sent it, running through every person in Jordan's life who might have reason to expose him. His wife, Sophie, was the obvious candidate. They had been married for 6 years, had a 4-year-old daughter named Emma, and from the outside appeared to have the kind of stable, loving relationship that made other couples jealous. But I knew from years of late-night confessions that their marriage was more complicated than it appeared. Jordan complained frequently about Sophie's demands, her expectations, her inability to understand the pressure he was under at work. He talked about feeling trapped sometimes, about wondering if he had gotten married too young, about the way Sophie's eyes had lost that spark they used to have when she looked at him. If Sophie had discovered the messages to Vanessa, she would have had every reason to expose him. She would have wanted me to know what kind of man I was defending every time she complained about him and I took his side. She would have wanted an ally, or at least a witness, someone who could no longer pretend that Jordan was the misunderstood husband he claimed to be. I reached out to Sophie under the guise of planning a surprise for Jordan's upcoming 36th birthday. We met for coffee at a quiet shop in Cambridge, and I watched her carefully for any sign that she knew what her husband had been doing. What I saw broke my heart almost as much as the screenshots had. Sophie was tired. Not the normal tired of a working mother with a young child, but a bone-deep exhaustion that showed in the way she held her coffee cup, the way her smile did not quite reach her eyes, the way she kept glancing at her phone as if expecting bad news. When I asked how things were going with Jordan, she deflected with practiced ease, but I caught the flicker of something underneath her casual response. Pain. Doubt. The creeping suspicion that the life she had built was not what she had believed it to be. She had not sent the email. I was almost certain of it. If Sophie knew about Jordan's betrayal, she would not have been sitting across from me making small talk about birthday cake flavors. She would have been confronting, demanding answers, doing all the impulsive things I was forcing myself not to do. Sophie was honest in a way that Jordan had never been. She did not have the capacity for the kind of long-game manipulation that sending those screenshots would have required, which meant someone else was watching Jordan. Someone else had access to his private communications. Someone else wanted me to know the truth badly enough to compile months of evidence and deliver it anonymously. I filed that question away for later investigation and focused on the more immediate task, building my case against Jordan. The screenshots were damning, but they were not enough. They showed Jordan's betrayal, but they did not explain it. They did not reveal the full scope of who he really was, and they did not give me enough ammunition to truly destroy him in the way I was beginning to realize he deserved. Because as I started paying closer attention to Jordan's life, I began to notice things I had been too trusting to see before. Small inconsistencies, little lies that did not quite add up. The way he always seemed to have cash even when he complained about being broke. The way certain clients he talked about never seemed to materialize. The way he became evasive whenever I asked specific questions about his work. Jordan was a real estate agent, had been for almost a decade. He worked for a mid-sized firm that handled both residential and commercial properties in the greater Boston area. He had always presented himself as successful, not wealthy but comfortable, the kind of agent who built his business on relationships and referrals rather than high-pressure sales tactics. But the more I looked, the more cracks I found in that narrative. It started with a conversation I overheard at the bar. Jordan had stepped away to use the restroom, and two men at the next table were discussing a property dispute. One of them mentioned Jordan's name in a tone that made me pay attention. "Callaway pulled the same thing on the Hendersons last year," the man said, shaking his head. "Convinced them the inspection was clean, they closed on the house, and 3 months later the foundation is cracking because of water damage that anyone with eyes should have seen." His companion nodded grimly. "Guy's got a reputation. Works with those flippers who buy distressed properties, slaps some paint on them, and unloads them on first-time buyers who don't know any better." I kept my head down, pretending to be absorbed in my phone, but I was memorizing every word. When Jordan came back, I did not mention what I had heard. I just smiled and ordered another round and filed the information away with everything else. Over the following weeks, I did research. Quiet, methodical, obsessive research. I used my skills as a software engineer to dig into public records, property transactions, court filings, and business registrations. What I found was a pattern that stretched back years, a systematic exploitation of trust that made his betrayal of me seem almost inevitable. Jordan had been involved in at least a dozen questionable real estate transactions over the past 5 years, properties that were sold with known defects undisclosed, buyers who were pressured into waiving inspections with promises of deals that would disappear if they hesitated, partnerships with contractors who had histories of substandard work and building code violations. None of it was technically illegal, or at least none of it had been prosecuted. Jordan was careful. He kept his name off the most damaging documents. He worked through intermediaries and shell companies and verbal agreements that could not be traced. He had built his career on the willingness to bend rules without quite breaking them, to exploit loopholes and ignorance, and the desperate trust of people who just wanted to own a home. And then I found something that changed everything. It was buried in a property transaction from 4 years ago, before Jordan and Sophie had bought their current house. The transaction involved a small commercial building in Somerville, purchased by an LLC that I almost did not notice because the company name was so generic and boring. But something about the address caught my attention, and I dug deeper. The LLC had been registered by Jordan using a slightly misspelled version of his name, the kind of minor discrepancy that would not show up in casual searches, but that was obvious once you knew to look for it. The building had been purchased for significantly below market value from an elderly woman named Margaret Chen, who had owned it for 30 years and who had died of a heart attack 6 weeks after the sale. I tracked down Margaret Chen's daughter, a woman named Linda, who lived in New York and who agreed to talk to me after I explained that I was investigating potential fraud involving the man who had bought her mother's building. What Linda told me made my blood run cold. Her mother had been in the early stages of dementia when Jordan approached her about selling the building. Margaret had been confused about the property's value, unsure about the legal implications of the sale, and had signed documents she did not fully understand. Jordan had posed as a friend trying to help her simplify her finances, had visited her regularly in the weeks leading up to the sale, had earned her trust with kindness and patience, and the appearance of genuine concern for her well-being. The building was worth at least 4 times what Jordan paid for it. He had flipped it within a year for a profit that Linda estimated at nearly $300,000. "We tried to contest the sale after Mom died," Linda told me, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Our lawyer said we had a case, but Jordan's attorney buried us in motions and delays and requests for documentation we didn't have. We ran out of money for legal fees before we got anywhere close to a courtroom. He got away with it." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "He came to her funeral. Did you know that? He stood there in his nice suit and shook my hand and told me how sorry he was for my loss. I didn't know then what he had done. I found out later when I started going through her papers. He stole from my mother while she was dying, and then he had the audacity to come mourn with us. I listened to Linda's story and felt something shift inside me. This was no longer just about my own betrayal. This was about a pattern of behavior that spanned years, that had hurt people far more vulnerable than me, that would continue unless someone stopped it. Jordan Calloway was not just a bad friend. He was a predator who had learned to disguise himself as trustworthy and kind, who exploited connections and exploited the vulnerable, who had built his entire life on a foundation of manipulation and deceit. And I was going to tear that foundation apart. The question was how. I needed evidence that would stand up to scrutiny, evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away or buried under legal maneuvers. I needed to build a case so airtight that Jordan would have nowhere to hide. I thought about going to the authorities, but I had been around long enough to know how that would likely play out. Jordan had been careful to stay on the edge of legality. Proving fraud required documentation that had probably been destroyed years ago. The police would file a report and tell me there was not enough evidence to pursue charges. The story would die before it ever got started. No, I needed to expose Jordan in a way that bypassed official channels. I needed to bring his victims together, to compile their stories, to create a weight of evidence that could not be ignored. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. And that meant I needed to get closer to Jordan than I had ever been before. I started saying yes to everything, every invitation, every request for help, every opportunity to spend time with Jordan. When he asked if I could help him set up a new website for a side project he was working on, I jumped at the chance. When he invited me to a networking event for real estate professionals, I cleared my schedule. When he mentioned that he needed someone to house sit while he and Sophie took Emma to visit Sophie's parents for a long weekend, I volunteered immediately. That house-sitting weekend was the turning point. Jordan's home office was in the basement, a converted space with a massive desk, 2 large monitors, and a filing cabinet that he kept locked. I had been in the room dozens of times over the years, usually just passing through, and I had never thought twice about what might be stored there. But now I was looking. Now I was paying attention, and I had 3 days alone in the house to find what I needed. The lock on the filing cabinet was a standard tumbler mechanism, the kind that security experts describe as more of a suggestion than an actual barrier. I had never picked a lock before, but I had watched enough tutorials online to understand the basic principle, and after about an hour of patient trial and error, the drawer slid open. What I found inside was a roadmap to Jordan's entire operation. There were folders organized by year, each containing documentation for properties he had been involved with. Some of the files looked legitimate, normal transactions with normal paperwork. But others told a different story. I found evidence of kickbacks from contractors, off-the-books payments that never appeared on official documents. I found copies of inspection reports that had been altered, original versions with red flags that had been replaced with clean versions before being shared with buyers. I found correspondence with a lawyer who specialized in what Jordan's notes described as creative structuring of deals. And I found a folder labeled simply leverage. Inside were documents that made my stomach turn, photos that should not exist, copies of text messages and emails that had clearly been obtained without consent, financial records for people whose names I recognized, some of them prominent figures in the Boston real estate community. Jordan had been collecting dirt on everyone around him, colleagues, clients, competitors, friends. He had built a database of secrets and vulnerabilities, a weapon he could deploy whenever someone threatened to expose his own misdeeds. I understood then why no one had ever successfully challenged him, why complaints disappeared and lawsuits got settled and people who started asking questions suddenly went quiet. Jordan was not just a con artist. He was a spider sitting at the center of a web of blackmail and intimidation, pulling strings whenever anyone got too close to the truth. The question became, was there anything in that folder about me? I searched through the documents with increasingly frantic urgency, and what I found was both a relief and a confirmation of everything I had begun to suspect. There was a folder with my name on it. Inside were copies of the messages I had sent Jordan over the years, the vulnerable confessions that he had forwarded to Vanessa. There were notes in his handwriting documenting my weaknesses, my fears, the pressure points that could be used against me if I ever became a problem. There was a timeline of my relationship with Rachel, with notations about when and how the sabotage campaign had been executed. But there was also something else, a document that appeared to be a draft of an email never sent, dated from about a month before I received the anonymous screenshots. It was addressed to Vanessa and contained a single line. "He's starting to ask questions. We need to accelerate." Jordan had sensed that I was becoming suspicious, even before I knew there was anything to be suspicious about. He had been preparing to escalate, to use his collected leverage to silence me before I could uncover his secrets. Except someone had beaten him to it. Someone had sent me those screenshots before Jordan could make his move. Someone who had access to his communications, who wanted to expose him, who had been watching and waiting for the right moment. I needed to find that person, but first, I needed to copy everything in the filing cabinet. I had brought my laptop, ostensibly to do some work while house-sitting. I spent the next several hours photographing documents, scanning pages with a portable scanner I had picked up specifically for this purpose, and transferring everything to an encrypted drive. I was methodical and careful, making sure to leave everything exactly as I had found it, to give Jordan no indication that his secrets had been compromised. By the time I finished, I had over 1,000 pages of documentation detailing years of fraud, manipulation, and blackmail. It was more than enough to destroy him, but I still did not know how to deploy it in a way that would ensure maximum impact. The answer came from an unexpected source. Sophie called me 2 weeks after the house-sitting weekend. Her voice was strange, controlled in a way that told me she was working hard to keep something contained. "Marcus, I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." My heart started pounding. Had Jordan discovered that I had been in his files? Had Sophie somehow found out what I was planning? "Of course," I managed to say. "What's going on? Do you know anything about a woman named Linda Chen?" The name hit me like a physical blow. I had been careful to use an anonymous email account when I first contacted Linda, but clearly not careful enough. "Why do you ask?" Sophie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice cracked with emotion she could no longer contain. "Because she emailed me this morning. She told me what Jordan did to her mother. She said someone had been investigating him, someone who was putting together evidence of fraud. She said if I had any information that could help, I should reach out." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Linda had not exposed me to Jordan. She had reached out to Sophie. "Sophie," I said carefully, "I think we need to talk in person." We met at a park near her house, both of us nervous, both of us watching for any sign that we were being observed. Sophie had come alone, leaving Emma with her sister on the pretext of needing a few hours to herself. Her eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a folder of her own, papers I would soon learn she had been secretly collecting for months. Sophie had known, not everything, not the full scope of Jordan's deception, but enough to make her suspicious. She had noticed financial discrepancies, unexplained purchases, cash withdrawals that did not align with their household budget. She had found a second phone hidden in his golf bag, a phone she could not access because it was protected by a password she did not know, and she had been the one who sent me the screenshots. "I hired someone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "A tech person, someone who does digital forensics. I told him I suspected my husband of cheating and needed proof. What he found was so much worse. The forensic expert had accessed Jordan's hidden phone, extracted his messages, and compiled a report that Sophie had been sitting on for weeks, trying to decide what to do. She had sent me the screenshots because she knew that exposing Jordan would require allies, because she could not do it alone, because she was terrified of what he might do if he found out she knew. "He has things on people," Sophie said, echoing what I had discovered in the filing cabinet. "Photos, messages, financial records. He keeps it all as insurance. I found a list once, a handwritten list of names with notes next to each one, people who owed him, people who were scared of him, people he could control. We compared notes. Sophie's forensic expert had uncovered correspondence that showed Jordan coordinating with Vanessa to undermine me. But he had also found evidence of other schemes, other victims, other lives that Jordan had damaged in his climb toward success. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been playing a double game for years, presenting one face to the world while operating from a place of pure self-interest behind the scenes. What surprised me most was learning that Jordan had been planning to leave Sophie. The messages with Vanessa had evolved into something more than the alliance of convenience I had initially assumed. They were making plans, discussing timelines, talking about how to maximize what Jordan could extract from his marriage before walking away. He had been consulting with a divorce attorney about how to protect his hidden assets, how to ensure Sophie got as little as possible in a settlement. Sophie had spent 6 years building a life with this man. She had trusted him with her heart, her home, her daughter's future, and he had been plotting to discard her like an outdated appliance the entire time. "What do we do?" Sophie asked, her voice small and scared. "He's so connected. He has so many people under his thumb. If we try to expose him and fail, he'll destroy us. He'll take Emma from me. He'll make sure I have nothing." I looked at this woman, this kind and trusting person who had been living with a monster without knowing it, and I felt a surge of protective anger that surprised me with its intensity. Jordan had hurt me deeply, but what he was doing to Sophie and Emma was somehow worse. They were innocent. They had done nothing except love a man who was incapable of loving anyone but himself. "We're not going to fail," I told her, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I've been building a case against him for months. I have documents, recordings, testimony from victims going back years. What you've given me fills in the gaps I couldn't reach on my own." I explained my plan, the one that had been taking shape in my mind since I first discovered the extent of Jordan's crimes. It was not about going to the police, not directly. It was about creating such overwhelming public pressure that authorities would have no choice but to investigate. It was about coordinating multiple exposures across multiple platforms, timing them to create a cascade that Jordan could not deflect or suppress. And it was about making sure that when the truth came out, it came from voices that could not be dismissed. Linda Chen agreed to go on record with her story. Her lawyer said they might finally have enough evidence to reopen the case against Jordan, especially if other victims came forward. I reached out to 3 other families I had identified through my research, people who had been hurt by Jordan's fraudulent property deals, and 2 of them agreed to share their experiences publicly. I contacted a journalist at a local investigative news outlet, someone I had connected with through a mutual friend and whose work I had admired for years. I gave her an overview of what I had found, and her response was immediate and enthusiastic. This was exactly the kind of story she lived for. A respected local businessman revealed as a predator, a web of lies spanning years, ordinary people fighting back against someone who had exploited their trust. The journalist spent 6 weeks verifying my evidence, interviewing victims, and building a story that would be unimpeachable. She found additional victims I had not known about, people who had been too scared to come forward until they learned they were not alone. She obtained official comments from regulatory bodies that had received complaints about Jordan over the years, but had never had enough evidence to act. Meanwhile, Sophie was quietly preparing for what came next. She moved money into accounts Jordan did not know about, documented his hidden assets, and consulted with her own divorce attorney about how to protect herself and Emma when the story broke. She was scared. I could see it in her eyes every time we met. But she was also resolute in a way that reminded me why I had always liked her. The story was scheduled to publish on a Thursday morning, timed to maximize media coverage and make it impossible for Jordan to contain. I had been waiting for this moment for almost a year, planning and preparing and controlling my impulse to confront him prematurely. And then, 3 days before publication, Jordan called me. "We need to talk," he said. And there was something in his voice I had never heard before. Fear. We met at the bar where we had spent so many Thursday nights. the bar where I had pretended to be his oblivious friend while I was dismantling his life piece by piece. Jordan looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes wrinkled, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a nervous energy that made him seem smaller somehow. "Someone's been digging into my business," he said without preamble. "I don't know who, but I've been getting calls from people asking questions. Clients from years ago wanting to talk about old transactions. A reporter snooping around. Someone's trying to destroy me, Marcus." I kept my face neutral, my voice concerned, my body language sympathetic. I was so close now. I just needed to get through this conversation without revealing anything. "That's terrible," I said. "Do you have any idea who might be behind it?" Jordan shook his head, but I saw something flash in his eyes. Suspicion, calculation. He was running through possibilities, trying to figure out who might have the motivation and the access to come after him like this. "There's something else," he said, leaning closer. "Sophie's been acting strange lately, distant, secretive. I think she might be having an affair." I almost laughed at the irony. Jordan, who had been planning to leave Sophie for my ex-wife, was suspicious that Sophie might be cheating on him. The lack of self-awareness was almost impressive. "Have you talked to her about it?" "I don't want to accuse her of anything without proof." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was harder, more calculating. "Actually, I was hoping you might be able to help me with that. You're good with computers, right? I was wondering if you could check her phone, her emails, see if there's anything I should know about." He was asking me to spy on his wife. The wife who had trusted me with her secrets, who was counting on me to help her escape the prison of her marriage. Jordan was so wrapped up in his own paranoia that he had no idea I was the threat, that I had been the one pulling strings all along. I pretended to consider his request carefully before slowly shaking my head. "I can't do that, Jordan. It wouldn't be right. If you're worried about Sophie, you should talk to her directly. Communication is the foundation of any marriage." He looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, disappointment maybe, or calculation, or the first stirrings of suspicion that his trusted friend might not be as loyal as he had believed. "Yeah," he said finally, "you're probably right." We talked for another hour about nothing important, and then I went home and did not sleep at all, replaying the conversation in my mind, analyzing every word and glance for signs that Jordan might be onto me. Thursday morning arrived, and I woke before dawn, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. The story was scheduled to go live at 6 in the morning, timed to catch the morning news cycle. I had set up a Google alert for Jordan's name and waited, watching the minutes tick by on my phone. At 6:03, my phone exploded with notifications. The headline was devastating. "Respected Boston realtor accused of systematic fraud, blackmail, and elder exploitation." The story was comprehensive, detailed, and utterly damning. It included quotes from victims, documentary evidence of falsified inspections, financial records showing hidden accounts and suspicious transactions. It mentioned the blackmail files, though the specific contents were not detailed to protect the privacy of those Jordan had collected dirt on. And it included a statement from Sophie, who had gone on record saying she had discovered evidence of her husband's fraud and had cooperated with the investigation to protect herself and their daughter. Within hours, Jordan's world had collapsed. His real estate firm issued a statement suspending him pending investigation. The state licensing board announced they were opening an inquiry into his professional conduct. 3 former clients filed lawsuits before noon. A criminal investigator from the district attorney's office reached out to the journalist requesting access to the evidence I had compiled. Jordan tried to fight back. He released a statement calling the accusations lies, claiming he was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by jealous competitors and a vindictive estranged wife. He hired a crisis management firm that specialized in reputation repair. He tried to contact me 6 times, leaving voicemails that became increasingly desperate as the day went on. I did not answer any of his calls. I did not respond to his texts. I let him twist in the wind, wondering why his best friend had suddenly gone silent, wondering who else might have betrayed him, wondering how his carefully constructed life had fallen apart so completely in the span of a single morning. The answer, when it came, was delivered in person. Jordan showed up at my apartment 2 days after the story broke. He looked like he had not slept or showered since the news went public. His eyes were wild, his voice cracking, his famous charm completely evaporated. "It was you," he said, the words coming out like an accusation and a question at the same time. "It was you all along, wasn't it?" I could have denied it. I could have played innocent, pretended I had no idea what he was talking about. But I was done pretending. I had spent a year wearing a mask of friendship while I dismantled his empire, and now that the mask was no longer necessary, I had no desire to keep it in place. "Yes," I said simply. "It was me." Jordan stared at me like I had suddenly transformed into a stranger, like the person standing in front of him bore no resemblance to the friend he had known for 15 years. "Why?" he whispered. "Marcus, why would you do this to me? We're brothers. We've been through everything together. How could you destroy my life like this?" I felt a cold laugh building in my chest, and I let it out, a bitter sound that seemed to startle Jordan with its intensity. "How could I? How could you, Jordan? How could you take my most vulnerable moments and use them to destroy my reputation? How could you feed my deepest fears to my ex-wife so she could torture me with them? How could you systematically sabotage my relationships while pretending to be my best friend?" His face went pale. He had not known that I knew about Vanessa. He had not realized that the same exposure that destroyed his business reputation had also revealed his personal betrayals. "Marcus, it wasn't what it looked like. Vanessa reached out to me and I was just trying to save it." My voice was harder than I had ever heard it. "I've read the messages, Jordan. All of them. I know exactly what you were doing and why. You weren't protecting me or trying to help. You were keeping me weak and isolated so I wouldn't be a threat, so I wouldn't notice what you were doing in your business, so I wouldn't start asking questions about all those deals that didn't quite add up." Jordan opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "Do you remember Margaret Chen, the elderly woman whose building you stole while she was dying of dementia? Do you remember standing at her funeral and shaking her daughter's hand and telling her how sorry you were for her loss?" His face told me everything I needed to know. He remembered. "That wasn't," he started. "She trusted you. She thought you were her friend, someone who was helping her navigate a confusing situation, and you exploited that trust to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from her family, just like you exploited my trust, just like you exploited Sophie's trust, just like you've been exploiting everyone around you for your entire adult life." Jordan seemed to shrink as I spoke, becoming smaller with every accusation. The confident, charming man who had dominated every room he entered was gone, replaced by something pathetic and desperate. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "Money? I can figure something out. We can work this out, Marcus. Just tell me what you want and I'll make it happen." "I don't want anything from you, Jordan. I wanted you to face consequences for what you've done. That's already happening. The lawsuits, the investigations, the licensing board inquiry. You're going to spend the next several years fighting legal battles you can't win. Your hidden assets have been identified and frozen pending investigation. Your wife is divorcing you and has enough evidence of fraud to ensure you won't see a penny beyond the minimum required by law. Your blackmail files have been neutralized. Every person you collected dirt on has been anonymously informed about what you had and assured that the information will never be released." I watched Jordan's face cycle through emotions: shock, denial, anger, fear, and finally something that might have been despair. "You've destroyed everything," he said. "No, you destroyed everything, Jordan. Years ago, when you decided that relationships were things to be exploited rather than nurtured, when you chose to build your life on a foundation of manipulation and deceit. All I did was expose what you had already created." Jordan stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly like a man who had just received a fatal diagnosis. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of my apartment. I never saw him alone again. The aftermath of Jordan's exposure unfolded over the following months. The criminal investigation resulted in charges for wire fraud, elder abuse, and tax evasion. Jordan pleaded guilty to avoid trial, accepting a sentence of 4 years in federal prison and full restitution to his victims. The licensing board revoked his real estate license permanently. His divorce from Sophie was finalized, and true to my predictions, he walked away with almost nothing. Sophie moved to a new city with Emma, determined to build a life free from the shadow of Jordan's crimes. Before she left, she came to see me one last time, bringing a bottle of wine and a handwritten note. "Thank you," she said, her eyes bright with tears that were relief rather than sadness. "Thank you for believing me when I said I needed help. Thank you for showing me I wasn't crazy. Thank you for giving me and Emma a chance to start over." I hugged her and wished her well and watched her drive away, and I felt something I had not expected: peace. The anger that had sustained me for more than a year was fading, replaced by something quieter and more complicated. I had achieved what I set out to do. I had exposed Jordan's crimes and ensured he faced consequences. I had helped his victims find some measure of justice. I had protected myself and others from his manipulation. But I had also lost something I could never get back: 15 years of friendship, even if that friendship had been built on lies, represented a significant portion of my adult life. The Jordan I had loved, the brother I had believed in, had never really existed. He had been a performance, a character designed to exploit my trust. But the grief I felt was real, a mourning for something that had never been what I thought it was. Vanessa tried to contact me once, about 6 months after Jordan's conviction. She sent an email claiming she had been manipulated by Jordan, that she had not understood the full extent of what she was participating in, that she was sorry for the pain she had caused. I deleted the email without responding. I had no interest in her apologies or her excuses. She had made her choices, and she would have to live with the consequences of those choices without my forgiveness or my attention. I spent a lot of time in therapy that year, processing everything that had happened and everything I had done. My therapist helped me understand that revenge, even justified revenge, carries its own costs. I had spent a year consumed by anger and calculation, channeling every ounce of my emotional energy into destroying someone who had hurt me. That focus had sustained me through some dark moments, but it had also prevented me from healing, from moving forward, from building something new. The question now, my therapist said during one of our sessions, is what do you want to create with your life now that you're no longer focused on destruction? It was a question I did not have an immediate answer for, but I thought about it a lot in the weeks that followed, and slowly a vision began to emerge. I started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped victims of real estate fraud navigate the system. The experience I had gained investigating Jordan turned out to be valuable, and I found satisfaction in helping others fight back against people who had exploited their trust. I reconnected with Derek, my friend who had been trying to warn me about Jordan for years. Derek had seen through Jordan's charm long before I had, but I had been too loyal to listen. Now, with the benefit of painful hindsight, I apologized for not taking his concerns seriously and thanked him for never giving up on me. "You're my brother," Derek said simply. "Real brothers stick together, even when it's hard, even when you don't want to hear what I have to say." I understood then what I had been missing all along. Jordan had called me brother, but he had never acted like one. Derek had never used the word, but he had embodied it consistently for decades. The difference was not in the labels we applied to relationships, but in the actions we took to honor them. A year after Jordan's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a man named Thomas, who introduced himself as one of Jordan's victims. He had lost his savings in a fraudulent real estate investment that Jordan had pushed him into, and he had been following the case closely. "I wanted to thank you," Thomas said. "I know you were the one who put all this together. The journalist told me, off the record, what you did. It gave a lot of people hope. It showed us that sometimes the good guys actually win. I told Thomas that I was glad I could help, that I was sorry he had been hurt, that I hoped he was finding a way to rebuild. I am, he said, slowly. But here's the thing I wanted to tell you. Something I learned going through all of this. People like Jordan, they think they're smart. They think they've got everything figured out, but they're actually the most fragile people you'll ever meet. Their whole identity is built on other people not knowing the truth about them. The moment that truth comes out, they collapse. They have nothing real to fall back on. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. You, on the other hand, you knew the truth about yourself. You knew who you were, flaws and all. That's why you could survive what he did to you. That's why you could fight back. The stuff he sent to your ex-wife, the vulnerable moments he tried to use against you, none of it destroyed you, because you had already accepted those parts of yourself. They weren't secrets you were hiding. They were just parts of your story. I thought about Thomas's words for a long time after we hung up. He was right, in a way I had not fully appreciated until that moment. Jordan's power had come from secrets, from shame, from people's fear of having their vulnerabilities exposed. But I had already done the work of confronting my own vulnerabilities through years of therapy and self-reflection. The panic attacks, the fear of being unlovable, the tendency to drink too much when I was lonely. These were challenges I was working on, not shameful secrets I was hiding. Jordan had tried to weaponize my honesty against me, but in doing so, he had revealed his complete misunderstanding of what made people strong. Real strength did not come from hiding your flaws behind a perfect facade. It came from knowing yourself fully, accepting the parts that were difficult, and doing the work to grow. Jordan, for all his intelligence and charm, had never learned that lesson. He had spent his entire life constructing an elaborate performance of success and trustworthiness, never realizing that the performance itself was his greatest weakness. The moment someone looked behind the curtain, everything collapsed. I do not know where Jordan is now. After his release from prison, he dropped out of public view. Someone told me he had moved to another state, was working some kind of entry-level job, trying to rebuild a life from the ashes of his previous one. I do not know if he has changed, if the experience of losing everything taught him anything about himself, or if he is simply biding his time before attempting to construct a new web of lies. I try not to think about him too often. The anger that once consumed me has faded to something more like distant acknowledgement. Yes, Jordan betrayed me profoundly. Yes, that betrayal caused me significant pain. But the pain did not define me, the betrayal did not destroy me, and the revenge I took, while satisfying in its completeness, was ultimately less important than the work of rebuilding my own life. I am happier now than I was before any of this happened, not because of what I did to Jordan, but because the process of confronting his betrayal forced me to examine my own patterns, my own choices, my own tendency to overlook red flags in the people I loved. I learned to trust my instincts more, to pay attention when something felt off, to value actions over words when evaluating the character of people in my life. I am dating someone new now. A woman named Claire who knows my full story and has never once tried to use my vulnerabilities against me. Our relationship is built on honesty rather than performance, on mutual support rather than manipulation. When I have panic attacks, she holds my hand and reminds me to breathe. When I worry that I am fundamentally unlovable, she laughs gently and tells me about all the ways she loves me. The contrast with what I had with Jordan, with what I had with Vanessa, is so stark that sometimes I wonder how I ever accepted anything less. The final chapter of this story arrived unexpectedly, about 18 months after Jordan's conviction. I received a letter in the mail, no return address, postmarked from somewhere in the Midwest. Inside was a single handwritten page. The handwriting was Jordan's. I recognized it immediately. Marcus, the letter began. I know you have no reason to read this, but I needed to write it anyway, for my own sake, if not for yours. I spent a lot of time in prison thinking about what I did and why I did it. The easy answer is that I'm a bad person, that I was born without the capacity for genuine connection, that I simply took what I wanted without caring who got hurt. That's the story you probably tell yourself, and I don't blame you for believing it. But it's not the whole truth. The truth is that I was terrified. My whole life, from as early as I can remember, I was terrified that I wasn't enough. That if people saw the real me, they would leave. That I had to perform, to manipulate, to control, or I would end up alone and worthless like my father always said I would. None of this is an excuse. I made choices, terrible choices, that hurt people who trusted me. I built a life on exploitation because I was too scared to build one on genuine connection. I betrayed you because keeping you weak and controlled felt safer than risking that you might see through my performance and reject me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know better than to expect that. I'm just trying to be honest for maybe the first time in my life. You were a better friend to me than I ever deserved. The real tragedy, the one I'll carry for the rest of my life, is that I was too broken to accept what you offered. Instead, I destroyed it. I hope you're happy. I hope you found people who deserve your loyalty. I hope you never think about me again after you read this letter. Jordan, I read the letter 3 times, trying to decide how it made me feel. There was manipulation in it. I could sense that. Even now, even after everything, Jordan was trying to craft a narrative that cast him in a sympathetic light. The scared little boy who never learned how to love. The tragic figure whose crimes were really just misguided attempts to protect himself from abandonment. But there was also something genuine underneath the performance, a flicker of self-awareness that I had never seen from Jordan before, an acknowledgement, however incomplete, that he had done real damage and that the damage could not be excused away with explanations. I did not respond to the letter. I did not know what I would say, even if I wanted to respond. The relationship that had defined so much of my adult life was over, had been over since the moment I received those anonymous screenshots, and no letter could resurrect what had been destroyed. But I kept the letter. I put it in a box with other things I have chosen to preserve from painful chapters of my life, items that remind me of what I have survived and what I have learned. Not because I have forgiven Jordan, and not because I expect to ever forgive him, but because the letter represents something important. It represents the moment when the person who betrayed me most profoundly was finally forced to confront who he really was. Not the charming friend, not the successful businessman, not the devoted family man, just a scared, broken person who had spent his whole life running from himself. That confession, as incomplete as it was, felt like the final piece of the puzzle. The final chapter of a story that had consumed me for years. I put the letter away and went back to building my life. The life that Jordan had tried to destroy. The life that was now more meaningful, more connected, more honest than anything I had known before. Sometimes betrayal breaks you. Sometimes it forces you to become stronger than you ever knew you could be. The difference, I have learned, lies not in what is done to you, but in what you choose to do with the pain. I chose to fight back. I chose to expose the truth. I chose to rebuild something better from the wreckage of what was destroyed. And now, finally, I choose to let go. Not to forgive exactly. Forgiveness feels too generous for what was done to me and to all of Jordan's other victims, but to release the weight of anger, to stop carrying the burden of what was taken, to focus my energy on what I am building rather than what was torn down. The story of Jordan's betrayal will always be part of who I am, but it is not the most important part, not anymore. The most important part is what came after. The growth, the healing, the discovery of what real friendship and real love actually look like. The understanding that vulnerability is not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength to be honored. The knowledge that even the most devastating betrayal cannot destroy you if you refuse to let it. Jordan tried to sell my soul piece by piece to the person who had already broken my heart once. He failed. Not because I was smarter or stronger or better than him, but because the soul he was trying to sell was never really for sale. It belonged to me, flaws and fears and all, and no amount of manipulation could change that fundamental truth. I am Marcus Thompson. I have been betrayed by the person I trusted most in this world. I have experienced the particular devastation of discovering that a 15-year friendship was built on lies and exploitation. I have felt the rage that comes from having your most vulnerable moments weaponized against you, and I have survived. Not just survived, but emerged stronger, wiser, more connected to what actually matters. That is my story. That is my truth. And that more than any revenge I could have taken is my victory.